The name John Brown echoes with the grim finality of Harper's Ferry, a man hanged for treason who sought to violently end the institution of slavery. He became a martyr for abolitionists and a madman to the South. Yet, legend claims that death did not grant him peace. They say that when the wind howls through the gaps of the Blue Ridge Mountains, you can hear the tramp of spectral boots. John Brown's ghost is said to ride the night, a tall, gaunt figure draped in shadows, his eyes burning with the same righteous, terrible fire that drove him to his raid. His phantom mission is unending, a chilling presence forever patrolling the borderlands of freedom and bondage, ensuring that his sacrifice, the first great blow against the Union's greatest sin, is never forgotten. He is the specter of necessary violence, a ceaseless, cold reminder that some evils can only be purged by fire and blood. Young John Brown grew up where the Bible was not just a book, but a covenant etched into the very framework of existence. In the sparse, diligent households of early 19th century New England and later the Ohio frontier, the spirit of the Puritan fathers still reigned, tempered by strict Congregationalist discipline. The Sabbath was a day of absolute gravity, broken only by the weight pronouncements of Scripture and the fervent prayers of his father, Owen Brown. Duty, not pleasure, was the watchword. Young John was taught that every soul existed under the sovereignty of God and the path to righteousness was paved with uncompromising moral action. He devoured tales of Gideon and the righteous wrath of the prophets, learning early that divine providence demanded a warrior's response to sin. This was not a soft faith. It was a hard, flinty Calvinism that viewed the world as a battlefield between God's light and the creeping darkness of human depravity. When the vile institution of slavery became visible, a stench in the nostrils of an absolute God, Brown's deeply ingrained Puritan morality provided the only possible answer: the duty to cleanse the land of sin. Once an abstract religious lesson became a literal bloody mission. His crusade was never political in his mind. It was a spiritual mandate, a holy war rooted in the unbending, covenantal faith he inherited from his earliest, sternest days. John Brown arrived in the Kansas Territory in 1855, not as a peaceful settler seeking land, but as a zealous abolitionist warrior seeking a battleground. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act had unleashed chaos, turning the territory into bleeding Kansas as pro-slavery border ruffians and anti-slavery free staters clashed over popular sovereignty. Brown, with his sons, was prepared to fight fire with fire. The boiling point came in May of 1856. First, the free state town of Lawrence was sacked by pro-slavery forces. Then, Brown received news of a brutal cane attack on Senator Charles Sumner in the U.S. Senate. Believing the time for meek protest had passed, Brown declared that the pro-slavery forces must be met with terror. On the night of May 24, 1856, Brown led a small band, including 4 of his sons, to Pottawatomie Creek. There, in the dead of night, they dragged 5 unarmed pro-slavery settlers from their cabins and brutally hacked them to death with broadswords. This horrific act, the Pottawatomie Massacre, was meant as a swift, terrifying retribution to silence the opposition. Instead, it threw the territory into a new, more savage phase of violence and retaliation. Brown's direct personal brutality made him a revered figure to the South and a controversial yet celebrated hero to many in the North. He spent the remainder of his time in Kansas leading anti-slavery guerrilla fighters, solidifying his role as the embodiment of militant abolitionism, a man whose desperate fight in Kansas would ultimately lead him to his final, ill-fated raid on Harper's Ferry. The violence of Bleeding Kansas confirmed the terrible certainty for John Brown. Only bloodshed could abolish slavery. Leaving the territory in late 1856, the next few years were spent as a shadowy traveler, crisscrossing the North and East to secure funds and support from abolitionist financiers, the Secret Six, for his final desperate blow. Under the guise of raising money for the Kansas struggle, Brown, often using the alias Nelson Hawkins, perfected his grand plan: an armed invasion of the South to ignite a massive slave insurrection. He ordered hundreds of pikes and rifles. In 1858, he conducted a test run, successfully leading a small raid into Missouri, freeing 11 slaves and guiding them safely to Canada. By the summer of 1859, the stage was set. Brown, now calling himself Isaac Smith, rented the isolated Kennedy farmhouse in Maryland, just miles from his target, the Federal Army at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His small army, a diverse group of 21 men, including 5 black men and 3 of his own sons, gathered in secret, polishing weapons and studying maps, awaiting the moment their war on slavery would begin. In the darkness before dawn on October 16, 1859, the stillness of Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, shattered. A fierce light flared in the windows of the Federal Army and engine house, led by the radical abolitionist John Brown. A small, determined band of around 21 men, including several of his sons, launched a daring, desperate strike. Brown, a man hardened by the violence of Bleeding Kansas, believed only an aggressive, armed slave revolt could finally cleanse the sin of slavery from the nation. Brown's plan was simple yet audacious. Seize the immense cache of weapons at the armory, incite a massive uprising among local enslaved people, and carve out a free state in the Appalachian Mountains. Initially, they successfully occupied the armory and the arsenal. They captured several hostages, including Colonel Lewis Washington, a great-grandnephew of George Washington. But the grand uprising Brown hoped for never materialized. The enslaved population, fearful and isolated, did not rally to his cause. The alarm quickly spread. Local militia and armed townspeople pinned Brown's raiders down in the engine house, later grimly nicknamed John Brown's Fort. The situation rapidly deteriorated for the abolitionists as they were surrounded and suffered heavy casualties. By the morning of October 18th, a company of U.S. Marines commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, with Lieutenant Jeb Stuart at his side, arrived from Washington, D.C. Lee, unwilling to risk his men, ordered an immediate assault on the engine house. The Marines quickly battered down the doors in a matter of minutes. The raid was over. Brown was found wounded, battered, and his face smeared with blood. Of his initial force, 10 men lay dead, 5 had escaped, and Brown himself was captured along with 6 others. Brown was tried swiftly for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, murder, and inciting a slave insurrection. He remained defiant to the end, viewing his impending death as a necessary martyrdom. On December 2nd, 1859, John Brown was hanged. His raid failed to free a single slave, but it was a catastrophic success in igniting the final fuse leading to the Civil War in the North. Many saw him as a hero, a martyr for the cause of freedom. In the South, his actions confirmed their worst fears of an abolitionist attack on their way of life, hardening their resolve to secede. The echo of the violence at Harper's Ferry would soon be heard on battlefields across the nation. December 2nd, 1859, dawned warm in Charlestown, Virginia, now West Virginia. The day John Brown, convicted of treason for his raid on Harper's Ferry, was to hang. Escorted from the jail, where he had penned his final prophetic note warning that the country's sins would only be purged with blood, he rode to the scaffold seated on his own coffin in a wagon. The field outside of town was not filled with a gawking civilian crowd, but with nearly 2,000 Virginia militia called up by Governor Henry Wise to prevent any last-minute rescue. Among the officers present was Major Thomas J. Jackson, later known as Stonewall. Brown, viewing the surrounding Blue Ridge Mountains, remarked, "This is a beautiful country. I never had the pleasure of seeing it before." He had refused a minister who had supported slavery, choosing to face his death alone. Brown ascended the scaffold with surprising agility and composure, unflinching in his belief that his cause was righteous. The sheriff placed the rope around his neck, then a white cap over his head. When asked for a signal to be ready for the drop, Brown simply replied that it didn't matter, so long as he wasn't kept waiting too long. After a period of tense silence, the sheriff cut the rope. The trap door crashed open and Brown dropped. His body hung motionless for several minutes before the wind began to swing the lifeless form. And Officer J.T.L. Preston broke the silence with a shout. "So perish all such enemies of Virginia, all such enemies of the Union." Brown's execution intended to end the controversy, instead cemented his legacy as a martyr for the abolitionist cause, further deepening the rift between North and South. John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry was a failure in 1859, but its echoes resonated long after his execution, transforming the national debate. His final defiant words from the courtroom galvanized Northern abolitionists, turning him into a martyr and a saint the just in their eyes, willing to sacrifice his life to end the brutal institution of slavery. Conversely, the raid fueled intense fear and outrage across the South, confirming their deepest anxieties about Northern aggression and encouraging them to strengthen their militias. The sensational trial and execution of Brown became a media spectacle that widened the chasm between the North and South, making compromise almost impossible. Frederick Douglass later proclaimed that while Brown did not end the war that ended slavery, he did at least begin the war that ended slavery. Brown's radical commitment forced the issue of slavery to a violent head, speeding the country's trajectory toward the Civil War and the ultimate freedom of nearly 4 million enslaved people. To this day, his legacy remains divisive: a terrorist who attacked the government or a hero who fought for human rights. The moon hung thin over Harper's Ferry, casting long, dark shadows where John Brown's last stand once shook the nation. A lone park ranger locking up the engine house swore he saw a tall, gaunt figure, his eyes burning with the old fanatic's conviction, stride purposefully toward the Potomac, only to dissolve into the mist by the river. Years later, hikers on the John Brown farm in New York report a crushing weight of expectation and righteous anger, sometimes accompanied by the crunch of heavy boots on the frost, as if the abolitionist spirit still patrolled his land, eternally ready to raise the blow against injustice. His phantom is not one of sorrow, but a relentless, chilling spirit of war. The chill that haunts Charlestown isn't just the mountain air. It's the specter of John Brown, forever walking the half mile where he rode on his coffin in a horse-drawn wagon from the old jail to the gallows hill. Locals say his full-bodied apparition, dressed in the dark plain clothes he wore to his execution, appears on foggy nights, a perpetual reenactment of his final walk from South Samuel Street to Gibson Todd House property. His eyes, it's whispered, still hold the fierce, unyielding conviction that led him to that fateful rope. A silent, ghostly martyr whose presence reminds the town of the blood that was shed and the greater torrent that was to come.